Good evening, I'm Klaudia Czerwińska and you're watching World News Tonight live from Warsaw. The U.S. will implement secondary sanctions on Russia on Friday, the White House has confirmed. The news comes as U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff held a 3-hour-long meeting with Russia's Vladimir Putin. More on that in just a moment, but first, tonight's headlines. Conservative Karol Nawrocki sworn in as President of Poland. Moldovan court jails pro-Russian leader Evgenia Guțul before escape attempt. 80 years since Hiroshima, the discussion on nuclear weapons is more relevant than ever. The White House has announced that the U.S. will go ahead with secondary sanctions against Russia on Friday, despite a highly productive meeting between Presidential Envoy Steve Witkoff and President Putin. Joining me live from Kyiv is our correspondent Alex Kadier. Good evening, Alex. So how significant will these sanctions be? Tell us more.
Good evening, Claudia. Well, if they are implemented, they would simply be huge. Secondary sanctions against Russia from the United States would mean that any entity, any company that wants to do business with those sanctioned Russian entities would face similar blowback from the United States. They could also face being isolated mostly from the global financial system because of the supremacy of the dollar around the world. So if they go ahead, these secondary sanctions would be extremely significant, only previously applied by the United States against Iran, Venezuela and North Korea. It would signal a significant shift in that U.S. position. Now, clearly, this has been a threat by Donald Trump in the last couple of weeks. He made it clear that they would go ahead, and that is what we heard from a White House official. But shortly after that, we heard from Donald Trump himself on Truth Social, saying that his special envoy, Steve Witkoff, had a highly productive meeting with the Russian president and that great progress was made. He then briefed his European partners. One of those European partners, of course, President Zelensky of Ukraine, who then posted himself saying that he had a call with President Trump, with other European partners, and made it very clear that the war must end. However, in neither of those statements were those secondary sanctions confirmed or even mentioned. Clearly, the message from President Zelensky is that the war that Russia started has to be ended by Russia. So the White House saying these sanctions will go ahead. No mention of them from Donald Trump. No mention of them from President Zelensky on the call with the U.S. president, with other European allies. Now, of course, a big supporter of Ukraine in the last few years has been Poland. And ahead of this meeting with Steve Witkoff, I sat down with Poland's ambassador right here in Ukraine. He said very clearly he hopes these meetings, these threats, are a lesson for Russia. Let's have a listen.
I think this visit of Mr. Witkoff and the ultimatum that was given by President Donald Trump should make Russians realize how hopeless, how reckless and how unvictorious are the initial and later on hopes or strategic plans for conquering Ukraine by Russia. And Russia should have known better after many defeats in the beginning of the war that they are not going to fulfill their strategic goals. And last 3 years should help make them realize that how they are not victorious.
So Poland's ambassador there to Ukraine, unequivocal. He thinks Russia should be made to learn the lessons of this war. We have this announcement from the White House that the sanctions will be put in place on Friday if nothing changes. But even if that doesn't happen, even if something does change, President Trump today signing an executive order slapping 25% tariffs on India for buying Russian oil and saying that this war in Ukraine is a threat to U.S. national security. So a change in language from the U.S. administration, but clearly this country, the Ukrainians across this country will be holding their breath in the next few days to see if the U.S. does go ahead with these dramatic sanctions. Claudia.
Thank you so much. That was Alex Kadier reporting live from Kyiv. Poland's new president, Karol Nawrocki, was officially sworn in on Wednesday. Thousands of his supporters flocked to the Polish capital to welcome the new head of state. In his first address, he voiced his Euroscepticism and set the scene for a difficult cohabitation with the current government. More on the events of today in Kazimierz Łysiak's report.
In the early hours of Wednesday, the new Polish president was sworn in the Polish parliament, where he delivered a rather fiery speech.
I will be the voice of those who want a sovereign Poland, a Poland that is a part of the European Union, but a Poland that is not the European Union. Poland is Poland, and it will remain so.
When it comes to his foreign policies, President Nawrocki represents a much more Eurosceptic, anti-immigration approach than the current ruling coalition. And while he supports Ukraine in its defense against Russia, he has often been critical of Kyiv. President Nawrocki said during the last days of his election campaign that he wants to ratify Ukraine's NATO membership no matter what, and that also sparks concerns over his approach to Ukraine's potential future EU membership.
If Nawrocki, however, takes over basically the Orban position, that Ukraine should not be in the EU, that would be a disaster, of course, because it would run counter not only to Ukrainian interests, but to the interests of most of the countries of the European Union.
President Nawrocki's narrow win in the election in June is perhaps something of a yellow card, a warning to the ruling coalition before the parliamentary elections in 2027. The government is now stuck in an uncomfortable cohabitation with a president backed by the opposition. While President Nawrocki says that he will be the president of all Poles, he was also quick to criticize the current center-liberal government led by Prime Minister Donald Tusk. And that's perhaps the best indication of what's to come during Nawrocki's term. He also indicated in his speech that he would like to see the Polish constitution be amended by 2030, which would perhaps give him more competency. That is unlikely to happen, though, as that would require two-thirds majority of the vote in the parliament.
This is not the first time I, as Prime Minister, have listened to a presidential speech, and this was also the case with previous presidents. I have heard this sort of speech before, one where you can very much hear a desire to have the competencies that the Prime Minister and government wield in the Polish political system. The constitution, to which President Nawrocki referred to repeatedly in his speech, is unambiguous on this issue. Therefore, I hope, though I can't be sure, that his at times snide and confrontational tone will not have any real consequences. But if necessary, we will of course stand firm as the guardians of the Constitution.
One of the biggest competencies of the Polish president is his power of veto, as any new bill requires his signature. And if President Nawrocki's criticism of Prime Minister Donald Tusk and his government are anything to go by, he will not be afraid to make use of that power. From Warsaw, Kazimierz Łysiak, TVP World.
What will be President Nawrocki's foreign policy agenda? In his election campaign, he expressed criticism of Ukraine and the European Union. In Wednesday's speech, Ukraine was not even mentioned. Michiel von Blumestein reports.
In his acceptance speech, new Polish President Karol Nawrocki was clear about what he thought of the European Union.
I will, of course, support our relations within the European Union, but I will not agree to the European Union taking away competencies from Poland, especially those that are not mentioned in the European treaties, and they should remain unchanged.
And he was clear about his priorities in relationship building.
I will support our most important alliances, including our bilateral partnerships with the United States, and I will also look after Poland's position within NATO.
Nawrocki did not refer directly to the Russian full-scale war in Ukraine or to the continued Polish support for Kyiv. Capitalizing on the growing skepticism towards Ukraine among Polish voters, Nawrocki frequently voiced his opposition to Ukraine joining the EU or even NATO during his campaign, which put him firmly at odds with his predecessor, fellow conservative Andrzej Duda.
Karol Nawrocki decided to show some assertive positions toward Ukraine, but it doesn't mean that he will stop the support from Poland or stop, for example, fighting with the Russian propaganda, Russian activity in European Union or NATO countries.
A specific foreign policy item Nawrocki does champion is his wish to expand the Bucharest Nine. The group of countries that make up NATO's eastern flank should bring in the alliance's newest members, Sweden and Finland, to strengthen it. But as analyst Andreas Umland told TVP World, this would require some ideological gymnastics on Nawrocki's part.
If he goes this way, if he tries to improve with his instruments the connections to the Nordic countries, that will, of course, mean that a very pro-Ukrainian stance in foreign affairs, a very Russia-critical approach, and also a pro-European approach.
At the same time, Nawrocki prides himself on his good relationship with US President Donald Trump. That, according to some pundits, is a great advantage.
Remember that even our government, which is less liberal and more critics towards Donald Trump, now try to build a good relation with the Trump. Because for everybody in Poland is obviously that Polish security depends on the US.
Ultimately, Poland's foreign policy is set by the government of Prime Minister Donald Tusk. But Nawrocki seems poised to make his mark as well.
Niech Bóg błogosławi Polsce! Niech żyje Polska!
For TVP World, Michiel van Blommestein.
This was a day that changed everything. 80 years ago, the world saw for the very first time ever the horrors brought by the atomic bomb. The destruction unleashed on Hiroshima serves as a lesson to the lasting responsibility of handling weapons of mass destruction, especially now when global tensions are running high and multiple conflicts involve nuclear powers. Our defense correspondent Zuzanna Jurek has more on the anniversary and current nuclear dynamics in relation to ongoing conflicts.
80 years ago, the world stood still as it observed the tragedy of the first nuclear bomb being detonated. In an instant, over 70,000 people vanished. The Japanese Prime Minister used Wednesday's anniversary to underline the country's commitment to non-proliferation.
It is the mission of our country, the only nation that has suffered atomic bombings in war, to take the lead in international efforts toward a world without nuclear weapons. The divisions within the international community over nuclear disarmament are deepening, and the current security environment is becoming increasingly severe.
But while Japan may be staunchly against the weapons, the world drew a different conclusion from Hiroshima.
They thought, well, these things are so destructive that we have to get them so that we can actually make sure that no one attacks us with these.
Currently, 9 nations, including the US, Russia and China, possess nuclear weapons. The US nuclear posture is vital to NATO's capabilities. Under the Cold War-era extended deterrence agreement, Washington committed to protecting its allies by maintaining nuclear arsenal in Europe. NATO's eastern flank has become increasingly more adamant about wanting a piece of this atomic cake.
The alliance should pursue a defensive strategy and respond to Russia's tactics by relocating nuclear weapons on NATO territory. Poland is ready to host these weapons.
That I will faithfully execute.
However, since US President Donald Trump returned to the White House, doubts have emerged over Washington's commitment to shared defense architecture with its European allies, worries which, according to experts, are unsubstantiated with regard to nuclear weapons.
The US administration has been pressuring allies to do more on the conventional front and to be spending more, as we've seen at the Hague NATO summit. But on the nuclear front, the message is relatively straightforward. The US continues to be committed and continues to provide extended deterrence.
Nonetheless, in its quest to obtain nuclear warheads, Poland began seeking non-US alternatives, including the possibility of extending the French nuclear umbrella eastward. Though Europe may have a smaller nuclear arsenal than the US, experts close to the subject matter, including the former Assistant Secretary General for Defense Investment at NATO, have underlined that this may not be an impediment per se.
President Macron of France has clearly stated that there was a European dimension to French vital interests, and has stated together with the British Prime Minister that France and Britain were ready to defend a European country. We are not in the Cold War days. The imbalance with the Russian Federation are not that massive. French and British forces account for roughly 20% of the Russian forces and can inflict absolutely catastrophic damage.
For TVP World, Zuzanna Jurek.
Evgenia Guțul might be facing a long prison sentence, 7 years to be specific, for her involvement with the pro-Russian SOR party, which she was accused of funding. This is not the first time Guțul was flagged as a pro-Russian influence in Moldova. She was previously sanctioned by the EU for destabilizing Moldova and fueling separatism. Anastasia Yanchenko has more details on Guțul's sentence and her Russian connections.
7 years in prison. That is the sentence handed to Moldova's Gagauzia leader, Evgenia Guțul. She was found guilty of illegally financing the banned pro-Russian, Russian-funded SOR party. The party was created by Ilan Shor, who was previously sentenced to 15 years in prison in absentia by Chisinau and is currently hiding in Russia. According to Moldovan investigators, between 2019 and 2022, Guțul helped transfer large undeclared sums of money, reportedly 2.2 million euro, from Russia to Moldova to support Moscow's interest, especially among Moldova's minorities, where pro-Russian narratives are much stronger than in the central regions.
She was instrumental in purchasing the votes of people from different parts of the Republic of Moldova, especially in the southern part of the Republic of Moldova.
Russian interference was especially visible during last year's presidential election. The vote, which saw Sandu re-elected, was held along an EU referendum narrowly supported by Moldovans.
There are many players which are interested in breaking the relations between the Republic of Moldova and the European Union, using a lot of money, tens, maybe hundreds of millions of euros.
Guțul is known for her strong pro-Russian stance. In March 2024, she met with Russian President Vladimir Putin. She has also been sanctioned by the EU for destabilizing Moldova and fueling separatism in her region. The Kremlin has condemned the verdict, calling it political repression.
The legitimate head of Gagauzia, Evgenia Guțul, has been sentenced to 7 years in prison. For lawfully performing their duties, the Sandu regime throws people into jail.
Moldovan prosecutors believe Guțul was aware of her potential arrest. She may have been seeking Moscow's help to escape, as did another pro-Russian member of the SOR party who was sentenced in absentia to 12 years for the same allegations.
Guțul was detained at the airport while attempting to fly to Istanbul, with strong suspicion that her final destination was Moscow. Her attempts to leave Moldova came just days after the conviction of Alexander Nestorovski, a SOR-linked member of parliament, in a similar case. On the day of his conviction, Nestorovski was granted Russian citizenship and disappeared.
Moldovan President Maia Sandu has warned that Russia is preparing unprecedented interference in the September elections and will use at least 100 million euro to bribe voters.
We have seen information interference, we have seen cyber attacks against critical infrastructure, we have seen abuse of these domestic vulnerabilities, such as the diversity within the Moldovan society, including Russian-speaking population.
President Sandu's pro-European camp hopes to maintain a majority in the parliament following the general election scheduled for September 28. If they lose, Moldova's future in the EU may be at stake. For TVP World, this report, Anastasia Yanchenko.
A high-stakes meeting at the White House this Friday could mark a turning point in one of the world's longest-running conflicts. The leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan are set to meet with U.S. President Donald Trump in a renewed bid to finalize a peace treaty decades after the start of the Nagorno-Karabakh war. Diana Skaya reports on whether Friday's meeting will be the beginning of peace or the next chapter in deadlock.
Hopefully, pretty soon, a peace deal between Azerbaijan and Armenia.
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio hinting at what could unfold this Friday at the White House. Azerbaijan's President Ilham Aliyev and Armenia's Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan are heading to Washington for a rare meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump. The goal, ending nearly 4 decades of war, or at least attempting to.
Given the unpredictable nature of the Trump administration, I do remain skeptical about the U.S. sustainability or any commitment to ensuring a durable, lasting peace the day after.
The two countries have clashed over Nagorno-Karabakh since the late 1980s. The latest chapter, Azerbaijan recaptured the disputed region in 2023, prompting the exodus of over 100,000 ethnic Armenians. Last month, the UAE attempted to mediate between Pashinyan and Aliyev, a bilateral summit which was hailed as the first real breakthrough, and while tensions have eased, the timeline still hangs in the balance. And now Trump is stepping in, hoping to broker a legacy peace deal. But expectations remain mixed.
Armenia has always been quite ready to finalize and move on. However, on the other hand, I'm not sure even conclusion of a peace treaty will be enough for Azerbaijan, given their consistent and constant raising of yet new demands for concessions and compromises.
The summit falls on the same day Trump gave Putin a Ukraine ceasefire deadline.
It's all interconnected.
And while it could end a 30-year war and pull both countries away from Moscow's sphere of influence, it might just mark the beginning of a new diplomatic tug-of-war.
Karol Nawrocki was sworn in as the president of Poland, marking the start of his 5-year term. What is the president's agenda and how is it going to shape the domestic and foreign course of Poland in the coming years? Alex Szczerbiak, professor of political science at the University of Sussex, joins me on World News Tonight to discuss what the new president has in store. Professor, thank you so much for joining. It's great to have you back on the show.
It's great to be back. Good evening.
Good evening. So let's start with President Nawrocki's address at the Polish Parliament. What is your opinion? What, in your opinion, are the most important takeaways from what we heard this morning? And what are some of the most important points on his agenda that he outlined?
I think it's clear that he sees his mission very much as trying to put the government on the back foot. He's going to be much less conciliatory than his predecessor, Andrzej Duda. Although Andrzej Duda was often described as a very partisan president, a notary, he did actually on occasions try and find a common cooperation platform with his political opponents. He often talked about what he called a coalition of Polish affairs. Karol Nawrocki is very different. He's much more combative. He doesn't believe that trying to find this kind of common platform with his political opponents is a fruitful way to go. And I think he sees his project as very much trying to confront, to destabilize the Tusk administration, to put it on the back foot, and eventually to hopefully prompt early elections. And in that election, a coalition of right-wing forces that supported him for the presidency would come to power.
And do you think that this sort of a lack of cohabitation between the newly sworn-in president and the government is going to be productive for Poland? What's your opinion?
Well, he's got to be a bit careful because if he just opposes everything that the government does wholesale, then the government can turn around and say that the reason that it's not making any progress, and the government has been very much criticised for failing to keep its election promises and not really having a very effective, positive programme for governing, the government can then blame Mr. Nawrocki for its shortcomings. It can say that it's blockages by the president that's actually causing the fact that it can't implement its programme. And in many ways, this is the government's best hope, really. It's very unpopular. It's very much on the back foot. And I think that if he's not careful, if he's too confrontational, if he's not strategic and focused in the issues that he chooses to block the government's support on, he could actually provide the government with a narrative that they can use going into the next election. And Mr. Tusk, Donald Tusk, the Prime Minister, is always at his happiest when he's in a situation of political polarisation and confrontation. So Mr. Nawrocki might want to put the government on the back foot and might want to oppose everything it does, but he's got to be careful, he's got to be quite nuanced, he's got to be quite strategic, so he doesn't simply portrayed as a blocking president.
I think the confrontation could be possibly the name of the game for both sides. But you mentioned before that former President Andrzej Duda, in a way, refrained from pursuing more power. With President Nawrocki, we see that he might actually aim to turn the negative power into positive power, meaning that he would have a greater say in the decision-making process. Do you think that this is possible? And what would actually have to happen in terms of legislation for the president to have more power?
Well, the Polish constitution doesn't give the president positive instruments in terms of promoting a policy agenda. It gives him very considerable powers, but they're negative powers. There, as you said, it's a legislative veto, which the current government doesn't have a majority to overturn. He can also refer legislation to the Constitutional Tribunal before it comes into force. But his ability to pursue a positive agenda is very, very limited in terms of his constitutional powers. But what he does have, and it's something that Andrzej Duda didn't have at the tail end of his presidency, is he has a mandate. He has a huge electoral mandate, the largest ever turnout in a Polish presidential election, and an election that he very much framed as a vote of no confidence in the government, and that's widely how it was interpreted. So what he has, although his constitutional powers are largely negative, an ability to stop the government, is he has momentum. He has the ability to be able to change the dynamics of Polish politics from the fact that he has this huge electoral mandate. And he needs to be quite clever. He needs to promote his agenda in a very clever and strategic way. But he does have that great opportunity, which of course Andrzej Duda didn't have, because by the time the Tusk government came along, he was at the end of his term. He was a lamed up president in many, many ways. Whereas Mr. Nawrocki has this opportunity to put forward this positive agenda.
Let's talk foreign policy, shall we? There are two sides of the same coin. On one hand, we have the relationship with the US, and on the other, we have the relationship with the European Union. Do you think that Mr. Nawrocki, how is he going to actually stir this transatlantic relationship? And do you think that he's going to veer towards the US while leaving the European Union on the sideways? I mean, we've heard during his campaign that there was a certain dose of Euroscepticism.
Yes, that's right. I mean, he is going to prioritize building links with the Trump presidency, with whom he has very good links and very good ties. There's obviously a good personal chemistry between them. But also, as you say, he's a Eurosceptic. He's what you might call a soft Eurosceptic. He's not somebody who wants Poland to leave the EU. Pole exit is not on his agenda at all. But he wants to oppose deeper European integration and protects what he sees as Polish sovereignty in a number of key areas, on things like climate policy, on things like migration, on Poland retaining its own currency. He made it very clear he was strongly opposed to Polish accession to the Eurozone. And in relation to transatlantic relations, he is very much opposed to the EU developing a defence identity separately from the transatlantic alliance. This is something that the government, I think, would have, had Mr. Nawrocki not been elected, would have moved much more enthusiastically on. It would have been much keener on developing Europe as a separate defence power, if you like, a separate defence identity. But I think Mr. Nawrocki's victory has made this much, much more difficult. And I think that given that he's Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, given that he convenes the Polish National Security Council, it's in security policy where I think he probably will have the greatest say and the ability to set the agenda the most. And I think this is the key thing he's going to do. He's going to say that the transatlantic, in terms of defence policy, the transatlantic alliance must come first. And while he's in favour of European countries spending more on defence, this cannot be at the expense of transatlantic relations. It can't be as an alternative to the US, because the US is the only credible military security ally that Poland has, according to Mr. Nawrocki.
I mean, Poland is all for good relations with the U.S., but it's also very important to keep a balance when it comes to the unions here in Europe, simply because of the situation that we have happening beyond Poland's eastern border. I wanted to take a moment to touch upon Ukraine and the subject of Mr. Nawrocki's address. He did not mention Ukraine this morning. He's been quite skeptical towards Kyiv in his presidential campaign before. How do you think this relationship between Warsaw and Kyiv is going to be shaped now that Mr. Nawrocki is in office?
So I think the first thing to say is that Karol Nawrocki is not pro-Russian, pro-Putin in any way. I mean, Russia actually has an arrest warrant out against Karol Nawrocki. So he's not somebody who's got any kind of sympathy with the Kremlin. And he's also somebody who will still very much continue to support Ukraine diplomatically, militarily, in terms of providing humanitarian aid. Poland and Ukraine have a common interest in blocking Russian expansionism. And in the case of what's happening in Ukraine, that obviously means Ukraine either winning the war or having a peace settlement on as favourable terms as possible. The difference, I think, with Mr. Nawrocki is that he feels that Poland has not been sufficiently assertive in promoting its interests where those clash with Ukraine's, because although there's an overarching interest in terms of stopping Russia and Russian expansionism, Poland has very different interests, Mr. Nawrocki feels, on things like historical issues or certain economic issues, like, for example, the interests of Polish farmers in competition with Ukrainian farmers. Mm-hmm. So I think he's going to be much more instrumental, while obviously keeping support for Ukraine. He's going to try and leverage the fact that Ukraine needs Polish military, diplomatic, humanitarian aid to advance Polish interests in those areas where Poland and Ukraine's interests clash. Mm-hmm.
Very shortly, because we have only but a few seconds left, do you think that Mr. Nawrocki will be able to actually introduce a new constitution by 2030? Your opinion?
The only chance of doing that is if the coalition of forces aligned with him wins the next parliamentary election. And that's unlikely that they will have a constitutional majority, but not completely impossible. And I think that he is the person in Polish politics that's actually capable of brokering that very broad right-wing conservative alliance spanning the Confederation and Law and Justice. It's a very big ask, getting a two-thirds majority in Parliament, and probably very, very unlikely. Mm-hmm. But if he can act as the sponsor of that broad right-wing conservative coalition, which came together to give him victory in the Polish presidential election, it's not completely impossible.
Definitely an interesting time in the Polish politics. Thank you so much. Alex Szczerbiak, Professor of Political Science, University of Sussex, was my guest. Thank you so much for joining on the program.
Thank you very much.
And so this would be all for now here on World News Tonight. I'm Klaudia Czerwińska. Please do stay tuned. We're back in just a moment with more news and features.